to continue on our rough chronology through the history of Adisham's woods. We're going to get more into closer to the present day, but still we're talking sort of 100 years ago. So I'm going to talk a bit about the heritage of the water tower, which is a building that many people sort of associate with the woods. Obviously, we call those two woodlands, Oxford Shaw and Woodlands Wood, the Tower Woods for a reason, and it's because the water tower is there. But there are some aspects of its heritage which may be less familiar to people, which I'm going to sort of talk through now. So to start off with, the water tower has been there since 1903. So it was constructed by the Margate Corporation District Waterworks. And at the time, Woodlands Road was barely more than a chalk track. It only really became a sort of formal road more recently. But that sort of tells you that it was quite sort of out of the way. It wasn't, you know, although it's a sort of route into Adisham now, it wasn't really a main route when it was constructed. And if you've ever taken time to look closely at the water tower, you'd have noticed that its appearance is surprisingly ornate, considering its quite functional purpose, which was to pressurise water into distribution systems. The main structure is built from red brick and terracotta, and it's built in an Edwardian Italian revival style, which was popular at the time, sort of late Victorian period. And the building's distinct architectural style meant that in 2001 it was grade 2 listed, and designated in that way. But aside from its architectural value, what many people locally might not be aware of is that it also has a very key literary heritage. And it's a key landmark in the writing of Jocelyn Brooke, who you can see in that photo on the right there. So Jocelyn Brooke emerged after the Second World War as one of the most notable writers to appear after the war. And his books are mostly semi-autobiographical, so they detail events that happened within his own life, but they have some embellishments for sort of for the reading purposes, I suppose, and for the type of aesthetic that he wanted to curate. So Jocelyn Brooke lived a lot of his life locally, most notably in Bishopsbourne. And he spent many childhood summers there with his family, and then he returned later in life to live at the same place where he spent those childhood summers, which is Ivy Cottage on the street in Bishopsbourne. And if you can't see it on that image there, but behind those rose plants there, there's a sort of plaque that shows it's sort of like a memorial to his life. And it's still there, it's still visible. So, in his series of novels known as the Orchid Trilogy, the water tower is actually one of the most significant landmarks that he describes. So he talks about writing, in his writing of the childhood summers that he spent walking to the water tower from Bishopsbourne with his family. And in that old photograph on the left-hand side, that is actually, you can see Jocelyn Brooke on the left-hand side as a sort of older teenager, and his mother and his nanny from when he was a child, who was a family friend. And yeah, the street looks very much the same today if you view it from that perspective. And so that's where they would set off on these walks to the water tower. And he describes them very, very vividly, capturing every sight and sound. And so his childhood, he was born in 1908. So when he describes these walks, he's talking about during World War I. So he was sort of 8 or 9 years old. So it's over 100 years ago now. And he talks about things such as the sound of the wind on barren downs, the distant view towards Pegwell Bay, the angles and the incline of the road, and it makes you realise how little has actually changed in some ways about the landscape and its surrounding areas. But he describes the water tower in particular as this key landmark on his walks, and something that they would never go past. It was what he understood as the sort of familiar zone. And he also describes, quite interestingly, some of the flora in the surrounding woods. So he describes how Oxford Shaw, which is the woods that the water tower is in, is really good for primroses and bluebells, and they would go there in the spring and have picnics there and things like this. So you can see some actual clips from the writing there. But he describes the water tower in a really interesting way, as well as sort of talking about the landscape and the slope of the road, and you could quite easily walk from Bishopsbourne to the water tower today using his descriptions. But alongside that, he describes it as having a sort of mysterious power, which he associates with the way that the tower sort of stands out from its surroundings, but also seems kind of impenetrable. So he discusses how it seems very sort of out of place compared to the surrounding woodland, but at the same time, because even back in sort of 100 years ago, it had an iron fence around it with spikes and everything, he describes that it seemed so impenetrable that it had this kind of aura of power that he could never quite grasp. And another thing that he talks about in this way is how the tower would appear and disappear. And a lot of you may sort of be familiar with this if you've ever looked towards the woods from different vantage points. But the water tower, you can see it sort of just peeping up above the trees there. But if you walk on that road, for instance, right until you get close to the woodland, suddenly it's disappeared and you wonder where it's gone. And that you only see it again when you get right up close to it. And the same as when you view it from different angles in the surrounding countryside. Sometimes you'll see the top of it sort of perching above the woods, and then other times it will just completely disappear. And that's what he's describing in that text there. So in the Orchid trilogy, he recounts experiences of the water tower from his childhood, but also early adulthood and pre and post World War II as well. And that's what makes his writing so important from a heritage perspective, because he depicts the water tower and the surrounding area from so many different time periods. And he does so in a really emotive way too, because he's describing not only the surrounding landscape, but the significance that it has for his life. So he speaks in a very sort of what's called a mythopoeic way, which is using the sort of aesthetics of the landscape to describe some kind of inner feeling and using it as a metaphor for what he's experiencing in his life, essentially. And that's basically the special thing that you get with Jocelyn Brooke's writing, is that it's such a deeply personal and descriptive way of describing a landscape that when you're actually standing in those very places today, you can really sort of feel the same things that he was feeling, and you can see and hear exactly what he describes in his text. So it's just a short introduction to his work and why it's significant to the woods and to our surrounding landscape. But I really would encourage you to read it if you can. You can get a copy of the Orchid trilogy, for example, really cheaply second-hand online. But if you go on walks around Adisham and around sort of Bishopsbourne and that area, and you read what he's written about these places, it's a really sort of powerful experience to actually be standing where he's describing and realising that everything is, you know, very, very similar in some ways. And yeah, it's a really interesting experience. So that's just something to introduce you to his writing.